All right. Well, hey, welcome everybody. I know a few are still streaming in. A couple have heard the early catch-ups here. I've been listening to the Smartless podcast lately, which is really funny because they spend the first few minutes sort of shooting the breeze with each other, and then they kick off the real content. So I guess maybe we're doing a bit of that here. But for those of you who haven't met me, my name is Mark Vanderzijl. I work for Johns Hopkins Tech Ventures as part of the Fast Forward team. And I've been pulling together these panels for the last year based on the advice from one of our mentors in residence, Dan Roach. The idea was, how can we get a group of startup founders and collaborators, people in the industry, to share some best practices, right? To hopefully avoid some potential pitfalls, to mitigate risks, and improve the likelihood of success for startups in our ecosystem. And we've had a few that were more sort of generic around launching, building, and scaling companies, few that have been more specific around particular topics. We have another in a week or so on regulatory affairs, which is quite specific. And today we wanted to focus on two, what I think are interrelated topics, being equity compensation and cap table management. So I'm happy to pull together a panel of experts to hopefully make me look smart. Joined today by Sherrod Davis, who's the Chief Operating Officer at EcoMap Technologies, Matt Hellauer, Managing Partner at PTX Capital, and Bill Stevens, the Chief Financial Officer at Previse. I'd like if each of you could maybe give a quick elevator pitch intro to yourselves, starting with Sherrod.
Sure, yeah, thanks, Mark. Sherrod Davis, one of the co-founders, COO at EcoMap Technologies. We're a seed stage company based here in Baltimore, Maryland, actually coming out of the Hopkins ecosystem. And we build platforms to power modern ecosystems by curating specific information and assets within communities and positioning those assets to their stakeholders to help drive various outcomes. We have dozens of customers. We work in 5 different countries at this point, team of just shy of 30, as I mentioned, right here in Baltimore, Maryland.
Great. Thanks, Sherrod. Matt, next.
Perfect. I'm Matt Hellauer. I'm managing partner of PTX Capital. The fund is 2 years old, focused on early stage investments in healthcare and the life sciences. Have partnered with several Johns Hopkins spinouts, Scene Health, formerly known as Emoca Health, Sonavi Labs, Cove Therapeutics, Delphi Diagnostics, and based here in Baltimore in Harbor East here. And it's been wonderful getting to know the JHTV ecosystem and the resources there with Mark. So honored to be on the panel. Thanks for having me, Mark.
No, thank you, Matt. And last but not least, the mayor of Dewey Beach, Bill Stevens.
You're funny, Mark. Thanks for bringing that into play. Good afternoon. I am Bill Stevens. I have been very fortunate to be part of several companies coming out of the Hopkins Tech Venture Group. Initially with Personal Genome Diagnostics back in 2010, then helping out PapGene, which then became Thrive in 2016. And then also, I know you had a conversation with Victor Velklescu yesterday, helping him as a founder in 2018 with Delphi Diagnostics, and most recently now with Previse DX, which originally was Capsulomics, joining them last year. All 4 positions in terms of Chief Financial Officer, so really connected in terms of this conversation around people and equity, and understanding the pluses and minuses of it. Just a little, plug for Previse. Previse is a few years old. What we've done is we've developed a test that focuses on esophageal disease, specifically esophageal cancer, on both of the detection as well as the prognostic. So that if you have the esophageal disease, our test will actually show whether or not you have a chance of progressing towards cancer in the next 5 years. And we're bringing that test to market as we speak. So we're at the commercialization stage.
It's great. It was funny last night. Victor was talking about. I was asking, how do we get more founders or train more founders to pair with all the great ideas in the Baltimore Mid-Atlantic area? And he said it was actually interesting. What he feels is like the founder group is just a tiny hub surrounded by a big spoke. Right? There's a lot of complementary people that you build your team. And this series was the Emerging CEO series, and I've got a COO, CFO, and an investor here. I know Sherrod, co-founder as well. But I was joking with Dan Lunds last night that I'm going to need you guys to be as charismatic as the CEOs.
He told me. He warned me this morning. Thanks, Mark.
Well, what's
Hey
great,
guys, apparently we have no personalities at all.
no,
So we're
think
just the brains.
the funny thing is that CEOs are nearly always in sales mode, right? Constantly pitching the company to whether it's to new hires or investors or partners, you name it, right? So it makes my job very easy to just give a forum like this to them and let them tell the story. But I was kidding with Dan that I'm going to have to hope that you guys are as compelling today.
Thanks, Mark.
And Matt, I hope you don't mind. Matt was talking about how well his perspective is totally different, right? It's coming from the investor side, and I said that's precisely what we wanted here to kind of give to you guys all have different experiences working with a lot of different companies, so you'll bring diverse sort of experiences and perspectives to this issue, and I think that will make this topic really helpful for others. Our last panel was actually focused on SBIR awards, which those who are familiar is a source of non-dilutive funding. So today, maybe it makes sense that we're talking about equity and dilution and how you may be diluting a company through investors and or employees, founders. So I thought maybe from a high level perspective, Bill, you want to at least give us an introduction to what is a cap table?
Sure. The cap table is a combination of all the voting, non-voting, as well as options or preferred or common stock that are typically owners of the company. It starts off as simple as the founders who come into play and take up a predominant share of the voting common stock. Then, as you know, since this is Johns Hopkins, assuming that there's some IP attached to it, take a percentage as part of their IP licensing. And typically in the seed stage, you're looking at bringing a preferred round seed as well as Series A, B, C, D on. And that process is great for obviously bringing capital, like with Matt's group, and funding the development of technology as well as the commercialization. But I think it's important that the founders have an education in terms of what that dilution means and how as you go through the various seed or rounds of capital raising. And they're also on the big side of it is when everybody wants to provide an option pool, and I know we'll get into a little bit of this details, Mark, for their employees. And I think that founders need to go out into this world with a clear message as well as education to the employees so they understand the value of the options, how the options really work, to set them up for success as well as to set up the founders for success. So I'll pause there because I don't want to over talk since
no, that's okay. And I wonder, maybe I'll throw it to Sherrod here as a co-founder and someone who's been through this a few times. How do companies kind of think about dividing up, even just among the founders, before you've taken on investment? I know Bill mentioned if there's IP that has to be licensed, there's a component of that, but just among the founders, like simple partnership, two people and an idea, are you going 50-50 or is it better to be 51-49? So there's some accountability and clear decision making. Now, how do you generally kind of think about that among the founder group?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the guidance that I've gotten is a little bit paradoxical, I'd say. I hear a lot that you don't necessarily want to be a solo founder if you can help it, right? I think founder groups of two folks are likely to be more successful than a solo founder. I think there's some stats to support that. However, I've also gotten guidance that you don't necessarily want those founders to be 50-50 for the reasons that you already mentioned. And so I think that the long and short of it is it comes down to what's fair. And I view equity largely, for the most part, as a component to total compensation package. Mm-hmm. And so when you're thinking about that as a founder, I think it's important to consider things as simple as like life stage and what the salaries of these founders will be if they're able to pay themselves or ultimately able to pay themselves. And then you incorporate equity into that conversation, again, as a component of the total compensation package. And so I also have a unique experience being a late co-founder to EcoMap, where it didn't make sense to be 50-50 founders in that case. And so I think you take it on a case-by-case basis, but try to learn from some of the wisdom of others that suggest that 50-50 may not make the most sense, because how do you break the tie, especially before you have a board? So that would be my advice from the outset.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and I think common mistake maybe is fair and equal are not the same thing.
Totally.
Right. And speaking of wisdom, a sage bit of wisdom I've heard many times from a colleague of mine, maybe I won't name names, but I figured out, is that make some of these decisions based on sort of what everyone's brought to the table before the company is launched, and then what the roles are going to be after launch. Like, is someone going to actively be day to day putting in a ton of work on this, where someone else is more sort of the genesis of the idea, but maybe a slightly more passive role or less time intensive? And then that can help you kind of decide what is appropriate, and to maybe have those decisions before there's money on the line, right? Before we're assigning dollar values to these ownerships. Now, maybe speaking of money, I'll bring in Matt here. How much do you have experience with this in terms of sort of venture creation, or do you tend to come in after some of those early founder decisions have been hashed out?
Yeah, our typical entry point is a turn after those initial conversations have been hashed out. But we have experience working in those foundational conversations. And what we try to do when we're in those kind of inning one conversations is just be advisors to those founders to make sure that the foundation of this house they're creating is strong. I mean, whether we're being first check-in or second check-in, what we're looking for is a really healthy foundation from a cap table perspective for the forward-looking perspective of the business. And so I think, Mark, you talked about that colleague of yours. If you're going to err on one side of kind of helping people, compensating people for prior work done or a forward-looking mindset, I'd rather err on the side of incentivizing people for that forward future value creation for the company. And so when we look at companies, the cap table and asking for that Excel spreadsheet is one of the first asks that we ask for when we get into kind of tier one diligence, just to make sure that that foundation is healthy. And happy to go through kind of what I look for when we get that Excel back from those founders.
Yeah. No, I think we should dive in. What I've tried to learn through doing a few of these panels is I may have a bullet point of what I hope to discuss, but I hope the conversation's organic. You three know more than I do, and so I'd rather follow your lead when it comes to what we should be talking about. I'm curious, are there any terms from, let's say, those who are licensing technology, Matt, that are like off-putting to an investor coming? If you've had to. Is there anything that you see from an institution that gives you pause?
Are you talking about the Hopkins itself?
I don't want to, I don't want to disparage any of my colleagues or any university licensing efforts, but that at times is a concern for founders, right? When they're doing a company for the first time and they know they have to negotiate some terms with somebody else where maybe the IP is owned. And they're concerned that maybe how is that going to be perceived later by investors? Is that something that's a concern that you've seen, Matt, or Bill or Sherrod?
Yeah,
go ahead, Matt. You take the first stab at it.
Yeah. So what we're looking for in that cap table, are there any big chunks of the fully diluted ownership that are being allocated to groups or people that aren't going to be core to the future value creation in the next 3 to 4 years of the company? There are some institutions, like in Hopkins, for example, when a license is negotiated, there will likely be an equity chunk that's carved out for Hopkins. And I think that's been streamlined quite nicely over the last 5-10 years with JHTV. And so there are nice comps there that I don't think it's an overly onerous position, but it's an appropriate position because Hopkins is just a very important partner to these companies. What we're looking for too is like the founder's, grandmother doesn't have, 20% stakes, or there is a co-founder that's left that has 20-30% ownership of the company. Those just indicate that there's some complexity to this story. When running a business is hard in and of itself, you don't need to be distracted by a lot of rewinding and reorganizing a cap table when you're trying to just get the business off the ground in these first few years. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, it's in talking about how Johns Hopkins interacts with the cap table and with the ownership. When I joined Personal Genome Diagnostics in 2010 on day zero to get them off the ground, Hopkins was not as evolved as it is today. We had simple licensing agreements with royalties, some minimum annual royalties, some milestone payments. And time to match point, over the last 4 or 5 years, Hopkins as an organization has matured into understanding how to operate within licenses in the IP format. And when I look at today, where Hopkins is basically, at least from our perspective, taking a sub 10%, 3 or 4%, at least from Previses, as part of our IP deal, I don't feel that's over the top. I think it's because without the Hopkins infrastructure, without the ability for these doctors and scientists to work to bring this technology forward, we wouldn't have this ecosystem being built. And it's easy that once we get out there and commercialize, look back and say, well, why are we doing this? But the reality is it is a partnership, and both sides should see it as a partnership. As from an evolution perspective, we look at, and Matt's great point. When you look at the cap table, at least from where I am right now, heading into potentially a Series A, since we did the Series Seed last year, how do we keep it as simple as possible to make it not too complex for the future investors to sit here and go, why am I going to invest in this company? Why, what does it really have? I do think there should be a balance of the past and the present in terms of those that had gotten us this far, and to those that are going to take us to the next level in terms of, but that's options. And that's where you have the ability to set up that option pool and to allow the first employees in to have some of the reward, provided that they're going to take the chance, that they're going to exercise, which, that's a whole nother conversation we'd have. But I'll let Sherrod comment if he wants to also jump on this.
No,
not at all.
I don't have as much familiarity in the in sort of that space when it comes to devices. And...
Okay. No, that's all right. But I have a question for Sherrod. So I was watching coincidentally a different webinar about cap tables recently, and they were talking about procrastination. And I think it's kind of human nature. You're busy, and maybe your startups are constantly putting out urgent fires, and maybe, Matt mentioned getting your foundation right at the beginning. Maybe that's something that's like, I'll figure that out later or whatever. I got this pressing issue in front of me. So are there any kind of lessons learned from like when you had to clean up a cap table later and extra costs or time and money in fixing something that just should have been done at the beginning?
Yeah, totally. Still cleaning it up.
Mark, I'll just use this term real quick, is that my responsibility at home when I was a kid was cleaning out the garage. So every 2 or 3 weeks, my job was to clean the garage. My father would get so mad at me because why did you start? And I'd sit on the back step and just stare at the garage. And the bottom line is you just got to start. You just got to pull everything out and put it back in the way it's supposed to be. And the cap table's the same way. When we started PTX, this was before everything was Excel models. This was eShares was just coming out there. That was before they became Carta, where all this technology were just hitting the cusp. And the thing about the cap, just do it. You may not want to clean the garage, but just get the process going. And once you start, pulling out the option agreements, pulling everything together, getting all the documentation, once it's done, you don't have to worry about it. You just keep it going. But you got to clean the garage.
Yeah, I completely agree. It is so much harder to like unwind that thing than to build it right the first time. Super expensive, super distracting. And so I think the challenge though for early stage startups is you don't know what you don't know. So try to find someone who does know, right? Like I think one of the biggest regrets we have is trying, like, fumbling ourselves to get something done. And then as the company becomes more sophisticated and you have real investors and a real board, you learn, oh, you guys didn't do this right. So then you have to unwind it, and that creates a whole new set of headaches and a whole new set of expenses. And so knowing what I know now, I probably would have done a better job of investing earlier, investing the little resources we had earlier into getting it right.
Mhm.
At some point, you're going to pay for it. At some point, you have to pay the piper on it. And it's a difficult thing to prioritize, right? Because 100% of nothing is nothing. So it
Yeah.
doesn't even seem like a task worth pursuing before you get to that level of sophistication where you actually have investors that are interested and are making money and so on and so forth. But knowing what I know now, I would try to find time to prioritize that and surround myself with people who are familiar with it, whether that's legal or folks that are on the panel here, because again, it's tricky to unwind for sure.
That's good. You definitely don't want to waste time or money when you're a startup, right? Or, I mean, no one should, but for sure if you're a startup business. And speaking of people who can help and experts, I should make a plug here for the sponsors at Fast Forward, who every month do office hours. We've got law firms, tax and accounting and audit firms that are willing to help. Bring your questions. Come, they will help you know what to know and what to prepare for. So every single month, those happen at Fast Forward. I'm also wondering, what was thinking maybe on some of the mistakes you can make. What are some of the lessons that maybe Matt or Bill would say to a first-time founder? Like, what are some of the mistakes to avoid other than procrastination?
Mm-hmm. So when we ask for that cap table, it should be a pretty quick response back, and a pretty clean Excel. There's a basic cap table, there's an intermediate, and then there's a third tab of a detail. And so that just is a leading indicator of just how organized the founder is and then the company is. And there's a broader theme of advice of just get organized early on. Like have a data site, either whether it's Intralinks or OneDrive on Microsoft, where you have folders, subfolders. And when you get asked these questions, it's just off the shelf. Otherwise, if you are not organized in those kind of basic building blocks for the company, you will not be organized in going to market with your product either. And so it's just an indicator to us of how you're running the business and that duty of care you're taking, even on the most precious foundational elements of the business.
That's why I was actually going to ask you that. Like, is it sort of a sign of competency and maturity, or a lack of?
Yeah, 100%. It's part of the leadership assessment that is baked into the fund that we have.
Yeah, I think Matt and Sherrod's comments are dead on. I think if you're going out there and with the thought process of wooing these investors, because they hear so many pitches, and you're not organized in terms of your statements, your responses, or your replies, not being able to provide that cap table almost instantly, it's going to give a clear indication as to what you're possibly dealing with going down the road of trying to commercialize a diagnostic or technology or therapeutic. I'll take a sidestep, and this touches on the employee portion of the mistakes. Is when, as organizations have evolved in this ecosystem, they have had the benefit of looking back to other organizations, what they've done, and following what might be the blueprint. But that blueprint has to be based upon a solid model and not one that's been piecemealed together. When you are bringing on employees, you think about, I got to raise money and I got to hire employees. So those two things are going to happen in terms of how do I get to that next level for this business. Both will end up tying into the equity. One, how do I raise the money and bring it in and give you the make sure that you understand what I'm doing going forward. Then how do I tie the equity plan back to the employees? So sitting down in the founder group with your initial investors and just saying, all right, we're going to have a 10 million share cap table. We're going to put 1 million over here for employees. And this is how we're going to do it. From the administrative assistant to the vice president of reimbursement, how are you going to manage the from that position and going forward? Because there's two things that happen. One, people have potential employees coming into the current ecosystem in the Baltimore market who have been around other life science companies, understand the equity play in the overall compensation. And if you as an owner can sit there and go, this is what that position has, and this is the percentage, and also speak to studies that have been done for a certain role, then you don't have to worry about the negotiation. You don't have to worry about it because it's kind of set in stone. And it allows you to do two things. One, make the employee feel like they're getting the best deal because it's already been determined what that role has and where it ties into the cap table. And it makes them at the same time also educate them. This is what like early days in personal genome, there was a lot of education that went on of explaining to the employees. And I'm not talking about the higher ups, but the scientists coming out of college of what these options mean. And, my wife always joked around that, options like a lottery ticket to a certain degree, because not everyone makes it and not everyone will turn it, but they need to understand that what it means to the potential of their future.
Mm-hmm. And another diligence item that we have there is thinking about how the equity is tied to incentives there and through various provisions, whether it's restricted stock and vesting schedules on restricted stock or vesting schedules on options. One of my favorite quotes is, I think Charlie Munger said, if you show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. And so we're just looking to see what the incentives there are for those early employees, because you can predict the outcome if they're incentivized properly through both time vesting and performance vesting.
That's good, because I wanted to today, if we make sure we have time to talk about two of the things you guys both just mentioned, and that's what equity goes with what positions and how do we use those to build in incentives for your workforce. But before we move too far operationally, I want to check with Sherrod. We once talked about ownership and control and how they're not always the same. Are there any things that you have to be aware of here about who has sort of signing decisions, or like when you need to make a decision later that this organization can help you be prepared for? Like, is that something that enters into the business operations?
Yeah, it does. I think you assign signers for the business, right? Typically the co-founders or C-suite level folks. And then ultimately you'll have a board who are stewards of the company, right? So they have the ability to take the company legally or operationally in a certain direction. And so when you're having those conversations about what the board construction will be, I think it's really important to think about who needs to be at the table, right? So we have a board of three. It's me, my co-founder, and the lead investor from the seed round. And that'll grow and change and evolve over time. But we felt like those were the three folks that we needed at the table to be able to ensure that to Matt's point, all of the incentives are sort of accounted for at that level.
Bill, are there lessons learned about making sure that your CFO cap table matches any that you shared with, let's say, your legal representation, like in keeping them updated when things change, so that you guys are in sync?
Yeah, great question. And it's back to Sherrod's question. There are numerous times that you can try to run and get things organized, clean them up, but you need to have legal as looking over your shoulder to make sure that everything has been done perfectly, so that you don't have any future liability/litigation issues in terms of how things are handled or how things may have been communicated. I am the administrator. We use Carta for our company. And it's a great tool from both the management of the equity side as well as, for the 409A valuations that need to be done every year to ensure, or at least through milestones, to ensure that the value of the options are adequate. But my attorney is also an admin, so she can get in, she can look at it, make sure that everything, just as a check and balance. It's never going to hurt have an additional set of eyes to make sure that things are accurate.
Yeah, you touched on Carta, Excel, maybe for early days. Like, are there any sort of, is there a time when you have to start paying for something more mature, sophisticated versus early days? Is it, I mean, not back of the napkin, but like, can it be as simple as Excel for a little while, or is it best to start from something more modern?
My point of view is that as soon as the founders take on the first investment, they should be invested in the platform. As soon as they've decided that we're going to take it on a series seed, we're going to take our initial, and you can get by a little bit with the first 2 or 3 hires with the option grants and the right documentation for that. But to Matt's point earlier, you want to make sure, if you're going to truly go out there and seek investment to move things forward, then you need to invest into the foundation and to make it. And it's not that much money in the grand scheme of things. It really isn't.
Matt, Sherrod, you both seem to be nodding in agreement.
Yeah,
I'm not
I agree with.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
No, I was just saying I'm not on the operating side, so I don't have the familiarity with, Bill and Sherrod of the day-to-day Carta work. We're recipients of those shares and can see the cap table on it. But Sherrod, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Bill. Like, I wish we had invested in Carta sooner, because for us trying to manage it via a spreadsheet that's not our expertise. And so if you can find someone who's super fluent in it, then I think that's great. But every new employee you add, anytime something changes, like to go in and have to update an Excel spreadsheet, I think is it just becomes a little bit unwieldy, I think. And so the sooner that you can invest in a tool like Carta, I would, because to Matt's point, like, those investors are going to be asking for the cap table. And so then you're going to be scrambling to try to update this Excel spreadsheet. And it's not as, to me, it's not as straightforward as it sort of sounds. You think it's just a representation of who owns what in the company, but it's a little bit more complicated than that from my perspective. And having done it on a spreadsheet and now having a tool, it's a 10x lift in efficiency, I think.
So if we, segue a bit more here into the sort of incentives and the using equity as a form, Sherrod mentioned, the total compensation of a hire. How have you guys thought about sort of an equity pool for employees, right? So you've got the founders, we started with some, maybe an entity you licensed from, maybe some investors, but then there's probably another bucket that's set aside for these could be used to compensate employees. I don't know if any of you really want to tackle that first.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think it starts with the philosophy of the founders in a lot of ways. We made a decision that our belief was that we wanted everyone to have some level of ownership into the company, every employee, for a number of different reasons, most of which I think align with what Matt said, which is show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome, right? We don't want there to be competing incentives, right? We want people to make decisions as if they are owners. Well, guess what? You are owners. And so to that lottery ticket concept that Bill mentioned, you can increase the odds of your own lottery ticket cashing by working harder, by working smarter, by making decisions that are in the best interest of the company. And so it was really important for us to ensure that structurally those incentives were aligned. I think so far we've done a good job of sort of binding those things around time. But Matt brought up another interesting point, which is around performance-based incentives as well, which I think require a little bit more sophistication, a little bit more thought and time and attention to get those right. But that's something that we would definitely consider in the future as well. So.
And that option pool discussion, Mark, usually comes, so it's usually an upfront discussion when the company's formed, but then at each fundraising milestone, it'll be a topic of conversation between the management team and then the incoming investors. And so when we get that cap table in diligence, we'll look to see what the available option pool is, what's been depleted since the previous refresh. And then we'll use that as a bridge to start a collaborative discussion with the management team on what a post-financing option pool looks like that can help bridge the company to their next milestone. And usually what we're looking for in that post-money cap table, post-financing cap table, is in low double digits, think like 10%, like 20% probably feels too high, but something that just gets a healthy pool of equity grants that can incentivize talent to come to the business.
Is there any kind of red flag that you look for that might hinder future growth? Like you mentioned sort of ranges there that feel healthy. Is there something to watch out for that's like, that's going to make later investors apprehensive?
I think when the pool is, when you see kind of prior mismanagement of the pool, then that might be a leading indicator of potential mismanagement going forward and a need for the investor to keep more guardrails and attention to those future equity grants. I'll go back to what I said earlier, is just they're having big chunks of the cap table that are reserved for people who aren't creating value in the business in the marginal day post-investment is probably the biggest red flag that you're trying to manage against.
To Matt's point, Mark, when this whole ecosystem has evolved over the last 10 to 15 years, right? When we think about the life science industry in terms of where the hot pockets were up in the Cambridge area, out in the Palo Alto area, now down in the Triangle area. So everything's been moving. And I believe investors have gotten used to seeing 9 to 12%, say 10 to 12% as the total option pool on a post round raise. And so that kind of is where you kind of lock yourself into. Anything greater than 12 may seem like it's too dilutive on the employees, but then you got to also reverse engineer. So if I say I'm going to raise $7 million in this round, and that round's got to take me over to a year or 2 year, whatever that timeline is. Well, what are my hires over that period? What am I going to need to do, and where am I going to put them in, and how am I going to incent somebody who's been at a very successful, mature life science company to join our team, to have these incentives and have this cash compensation as part of it. So I think you really need to how do I reverse engineer it, and how do I make it make sense for the employee, the employer, the investor, and all of the stakeholders. And I think that it takes to sit down and mapping it out, kind of like an EcoMap.
Exactly.
Bill brings up a great point of like the cap table is not a static document. It is something that should be evolving and should be modeled out as you go through these milestones. Like founders should prepare for dilution. They should prepare for future hires. Like a founder that owns 60% at the ownership should be prepared mentally that they will not own 60% post financing. And it's just kind of simple math of and a reflection of the capital needs of the business too going forward. But it's very much a dynamic tool with the company.
Yeah, Matt's a great point, because we actually had, when we started PGDX, I remember being in a conference room with Luis Diaz and Victor Valclescu, and we started with the founders, at 100%, then pre-money, money, post, and after 3 rounds, those founders are down to 15%. In terms of, and the conversation was, would you rather have 10% of a watermelon or 100% of a grape? And it's like, all right, we understand. And it's understanding that ownership's going to change.
Yeah, I think it's important to note to move a company forward. Some businesses have the option of bootstrapping or building through revenue, but a lot of companies will require an equity injection into those companies to hit the next deliverable or milestone, and to understand that having a smaller piece of a bigger pie and having partners aligned with you that bring more than just money is worth it for a number of reasons. So it's important to understand that you're not going to stay with your original percent ownership, and that might be okay. Sherrod, back to one of your earlier points, and I think through reading some of your background, you think about company culture and how do you use this tool to recruit talent to the organization? How do you think about it as part of the compensation model? So I'm wondering what your sort of philosophy of that is how does this can tie into building your team and getting them on board, especially in the early days where maybe it can't be as much of a salary as maybe some later you may be able to offer.
Yeah, I think it's honestly best to approach certainly new employees and certainly new employees that you think will be significant contributors in the same way that you approach investors, right? Like you have to sell them on the dream, on the vision, because what you have today is ultimately not worth as much. And the reality is we can't pay you what Google or Microsoft or enter any other big tech company can pay you. But what we can offer you is the opportunity to make a bunch of money down the road. And here's how we're thinking about getting to that point. And so when you have a conversation with a prospective employee and you ask them, what is it that you think you want to make, right? What would make you feel comfortable? You try to get them to that point, but you also have to be honest with the fact that you can't pay in the top 1% of salaries, but you can leverage equity to make the entire compensation package really, really competitive for top tier talent.
I had another theory pointed out to me that maybe equity, and Bill may have alluded to this earlier, is that equity should maybe be more how you think about a certain position or role within your organization as opposed to a specific human being. Have any of you guys thought about that? Right, like this role should align with this much equity. Is that something that you've thought about, Bill? Or
absolutely. It's the easiest way to basically set the ground rules in terms of recruiting and bringing people in place, but also in dealing with investors. Like if I go to Matt and say, hey, Matt, here's our pre-money valuation, here's the shares outstanding, and this is what I need for the option pool. The question is going to be, how are you going to use that option pool? Like if I'm just throwing 1 million shares into an option pool, well, how are they going to be used? And it's going to say, well, I'm going to hire these 9 people, and it's this, 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 and this. And not individuals to be determined on the names, but the actual positions. Because it's not like we're just going to put the equity options in our pockets to make sure that we're not diluted. It has to be for the growth of the business, and it has to be logical based upon your current cash position, your future cash position, and what you're doing from an operation perspective. It has to map out.
And yeah, I'm in promoting this panel, I talked about how equity is one of the most valuable assets to a company. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to some lessons learned about maybe mistakes in giving equity away to some person or position, and what maybe you can learn from that later. Because you think everything's in negotiation at some point, whether it's hiring somebody or to an investor or when licensing technology. How do you think about like, oh gosh, that was a mistake on what we did with equity there? Or maybe you all have never made mistakes.
If you hadn't made a mistake, you're not trying. I think from my perspective, there have been situations prior to understanding how to map and to understand the future use of the options where we're trying to recruit a specific person into the organization and being maybe a little too wishy-washy in terms of how to get there. And then you have that person on board, and then you find the next great hire. And unfortunately, you don't have enough equity or things are not right size. And you spend the next X amount of months and or years trying to right size the ship because of an over grant, trying to be fair, as you said earlier when in conversation, Sherrod, it's fair and equitable or two different things. because you really want, at the end of the day, when you have a liquidating event, when those options are converting into shares and everyone has the win, to be able to look back and go, yeah, the money's being distributed as it should, based upon who contributed. But it's those early mistakes that will maybe being a little too eager on bringing somebody on, that you'll pay for with future recruiting and hiring.
Sherrod, have you seen anything similar? Like you were at a pretty rapidly growing company before EcoMap as well. Have you seen anything similar? I'm not, no name names or shame anybody here, but lessons learned.
Yeah. I think to Bill's point, you can certainly add more options for people over time, right? So my recommendation would maybe be err on the side of being a little bit underweight here, and then you can top them off later. That's much easier than clawing anything back. And then the other thing that I would say, and this is totally standard, but it's important, is the 1-year cliff, 4-year vesting.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. So, you grant options whenever. Some people do it the day you start, some people wait. But the idea is that you don't get anything if you're not here for a year. And so that's a really important component, again, to ensure that the incentives are aligned. So just
in case someone's not familiar with vesting, can you just briefly address what 4-year vesting is?
Yeah, sure. So 1-year cliff, the cliff is when, and Bill and Matt can help me out here, but a 1-year cliff is essentially, I can grant Matt 100,000 options, and after 1 year, he would get 25,000 of those options. And then typically beyond that, I believe it vests monthly. Is that what you guys are seeing? After the 1-year cliff. So then every other month, you're getting 1/36 of that 100,000 options, which is the vesting period. So it vests over time. The options that you have are accruing over time.
Matt, do you, as investors, view the option pool as an asset of the company, right? Is this something that they should be very careful with, that they can use to improve outcomes and get the right people on board?
Yeah, absolutely. I think of kind of compensation broadly as ways to incentivize longevity, loyalty, and then performance. And then compensation can be broken up into kind of 2 sub buckets. You have the salary, which can be variable in a bonus, and then fixed. And I think that variable part is very important to incentivize performance for the bonus every year. And then, like you said, Mark, the equity part is a piece to incentivize new talent, but also continued grants for better performance and good performance for current employees. So yeah, it's definitely a tool that should be used, and the most experienced CEOs know how to use it very well and properly, and drive performance in the business, not just as a passive tool. Like, they're always thinking about how to reward and attract talent in the organization.
You mentioned,
Matt, you may have a better, more broader viewpoint of this, because we talk about a cliff and we talk about the vesting over a period of time, but then what you also have is if employees leave, if they leave prior to the year, then they don't get any options. But after they leave, there usually is a period for which they can exercise. It's called 90 days when they can exercise their option. What I've seen is a relatively, what I think is a pretty good percentage of those options that come back into the pool that people aren't exercising, because there's a reason why they're leaving the organization. Whether it's not a fit for them, or it's just not a good cultural fit, or they're wooed away. But I tend to see around 20 or 30% of those options that have been granted coming back into the pool also. So there's also that type of mental management of knowing that the cap table will change, is constantly going to change with that.
Yeah.
And Matt, you mentioned some incentives earlier, and I think we've all kind of touched on it a bit in addition to time, right? 4 years of making sure people are sticking around. Have you seen other tools for, like, say, milestones or performance-based metrics that are used as an incentive, in addition to or in lieu of just purely months on the job?
Yeah, definitely. So that variable part of the salary each year is important, I think. I mean, you want to have people get a good fixed number that is fair and feels like they're getting can take care of their family and personal needs. But then if the business outperforms or they outperform individually, then there should be rewards for that. And usually I like to think of that variable component in kind of macro company-based KPIs where everyone's driving towards big goals on the scoreboard, like $5 million in revenue by January. And then also individual KPIs, like if you are on the front lines and you're selling and you have targets to sell 2 of that 5 million and in contracts that year, then you should be rewarded appropriately for that performance as well. And so I like the people who are on the front line selling, I like to have that variable component a lot heavier than the fixed relative to others, because they're the ones that are bringing in those contracts to the top of the funnel. It's hard for someone who's like head of R&D to actually be driving the pipeline in Salesforce. And so they should be compensated slightly differently, but the ones that are selling should be incentivized properly to bring in that top of the funnel.
So we have a question in the chat, and I had a few in advance from the audience. Question in the chat was about how much equity is typical for a PI who wants to be a co-founder. So this may be something where Bill's got some more experience there, where you're dealing with maybe a university inventor who's the PI and is going to be a co-founder, but maybe not a full-time hire. Maybe is there? There's probably not a typical amount of equity. I suspect it always varies, but maybe the mindset that you use to approach that.
It's to Sherrod's comment early on. It's there's not a set model. There's not a set number that sits in and go, all right, it should be 18% or 20% or whatever that number is. You need to look at it from those founders of what they've contributed to get to this point, and then what they're going to be part of moving forward in the short term and then the long term. In each of the organizations that I've been part of, the founder's ownership has been completely different. And I think it has to do with how much intellect was put into the actual IP by an individual on one side, how much work they're going to be doing going forward to get this IP and do a tech transfer into a commercial strategy. And at the end of the day, Mark, each party either giving the equity or holding the equity should feel that this is fair. Like that's kind of when you think of fair market value. It's how things, the buyer and seller. It's a transaction. So if the 4 of us are partners in a company, all 4 of us should be at the end of the day going, yeah, I get why Matt has 18% and Bill has 7%. Like I get it. It makes sense for the organization, but it's got to feel good on both sides of the transaction.
Sherrod, I'm wondering how maybe you feel about similar topic, but with advisory board positions, right? As opposed to maybe a PI, an inventor. Like, how do you think about what equity is when it's right and how much is right for people on the advisory board?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's something that we've talked a lot about, but haven't formalized. So I actually don't have a ton of experience with it. I've heard mixed things, which is sort of why I think haven't, fully moved forward with something formal. I will say that I can see the value and the benefit, but I don't know that it is completely necessary. My advice would be, if you are going to do that, then it needs to be like really specific with what you as the founders are expecting from the advisory board. Bill or Matt, I'm not sure if you've seen a lot of advisory board models that are effective or ineffective, but I haven't really.
So the only thing I'll comment is to what extent is the advisory board advising, and what is the relative value to the overall success of the organization? Now, I'll use this as an example, and I won't name names or give away anything, but I had a potential investor in one of the entities say you really should have more conversations with your advisory board since they don't know what's going on. And it was a potential investor. Now, we wanted to have these 6 names on a slide deck to raise funds because these were big 6 names. But one was a friend. This potential investor was a friend of one, and called and said, "Hey, what do you think about this organization?" And it's to Sherrod's point, why do you have them as advisors? And it almost comes back to another point that you made is, from when you're taking on investors or advisors, there has to be a reason why you're bringing them on for future value. There has to be a reason that they're going to contribute to, from an advisor perspective, they're going to contribute to science, they're going to help and translate into commercial activities. They have relationships within organizations that can help with clinical studies, clinical utility studies, et cetera. There's a reason why they're there. And what I've seen recently is more towards an hourly rate or a monthly stipend of cash versus equity, because again, I think the ecosystem has evolved where people aren't just going to give up their time for a lottery ticket. There's got to be a combination thereof. That's what I'm seeing right now.
Yeah, I agree with everything Sherrod and Bill said. The only thing I'll add is in the startup's life, there will be good times and bad. Like, that is guaranteed. And so the one thing you want to avoid is you want to manage your fixed and variable costs, and having a steady stream of, $50K, $100K a year to advisors that kind of feel good at the time, but in 3 or 4 years from now might not be that valuable, but you're contractually obligated to pay something out of the business, might be difficult. So as much as you can, keep them variable, keep them hourly, like Bill said, because you just want to manage those peaks and troughs that are inevitably going to come.
Speaking of evolutions, our last question in the chat, probably the last we'll be able to get to, and maybe start with Matt here. Have you seen anything of this change over the last 1 or 2 years as kind of equity markets have changed, valuations have changed? Is there any trend or anything different today than there was 2 years ago?
So yes, I mean, from a high level, valuations have certainly come down. I think we went through this, decade and a half of just rapid startup making and high velocity, early stage company formation and investing. And I think through that process since 2010, a lot of kind of patterns have been set in stone, like 4-year vesting standard, 1-year cliff, like 10 million shares at founding. And I think so there were a lot of benefits to the exuberance of the last 10 years, because I think it created some good practices that are now commonplace and table stakes now for companies. I'd say the most important thing that in this new environment, where I think it will be challenging to raise funds for several years now, is to prepare yourself for the fan of outcomes for the company. In the no funding scenario, where you will be forced to bootstrap this business over the next 12 to 36 months, and to the scenario where you do get funding. And so just preparing your mind for that spectrum will be a successful culture to set in the company. Well,
we're at the top of the hour. You 3 have been very generous with your time, which I always joke, my boss says I'm customer service and overhead, so I need to value your time as much as possible, and anybody else. But he says it about himself too. It's not just about me. So thank you guys. I really do appreciate it. I think this will hopefully be very valuable for people here today and those who watch the recording later. And for anyone out there in the audience, we've got another one of these coming up on the 22nd on regulatory. There's a back catalog now in the digital library, and I'll be in touch with all the registrants for ways to watch those. So Bill, Sherrod, Matt, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for the opportunity, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
All right. Thanks, guys. See you.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.